Hello everybody and welcome to today's IoIC webinar where we're going to be talking about how culture eats strategy for breakfast. We're thrilled to be joining us today Richard Bridge, who is founder and CEO of creative agency Top Banana, and Karen Weaver, who is head of internal communication at Virgin Media Business. So Richard and Karen will be talking to us about how internal communication professionals can adopt a number of engagement levers to build and maintain a great business culture. And Karen will also be sharing some practical examples of how she's keeping the Virgin spirit alive through different events and initiatives. So hopefully lots of practical top tips for us to take away today. Before I hand over to Richard and Karen, I would just like to point out that we are recording the webinar today, so don't worry too much about making furious notes, as hopefully you'll be able to come back and look through everything at a later date. And also, if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask Richard and Karen, do pop them into the chat box and I can come back online later to pose those questions. So at that point, I would just like to pass over to Richard and Karen, and thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Perfect. Thanks, Jenny. And hello, everybody. Welcome to this short webinar. I've got Karen Weaver with me. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think it's a phrase that a lot of you may have heard. In the past, it was made famous by Mark Fields, the president of Ford. But how true is it? I think there's no denying that a business has to have a good strategy or a plan. I think that's a given. But it means nothing if it just stays in the boardroom and doesn't get delivered. Culture plays a huge role in turning strategy into action, as it can't be delivered if it's not done by its people. So Karen, as I say, is with us, and we're both brilliantly beautiful and absolutely delighted by our photos being on screen. Karen is the head of internal comms for Virgin Media Business, and we've worked with her over the very much past few years in terms of bringing some of the strategy to life in relation to Virgin Media Business. I think creativity and building cultures have been some of the key drivers and the reason for some of the success and engagement that we've had over the time. So what are we going to cover today? And feel free to send in your questions, as Jenny said. It looks like there's a couple of people struggling with audio, but it is being recorded. Hopefully we'll be able to deal with those at a later date. Anyway, we're going to talk about what is culture. And I think what's interesting is that why is it finally being a conversation that businesses are now talking about? Because culture has always existed. And I think what role should internal comms play, and in terms of what Karen is doing to try and help build a brilliant culture and some engagement in terms of how she is starting to deliver that within Virgin Media Business. And hopefully we'll give you some top tips to take away towards the end of the session. So what is culture? Culture isn't something that can be fixed overnight. So rest assured that it's something that it's a behaviour, it's values, it's rewards, it's rituals, it's the office environment, and probably, I know it sounds naff, it's the feeling. You can get that feel when you walk into an organisation. We've all done it when we've walked into an office, and you feel it straight away. It's in the air. It's the people that you connect with, the energy that they have. It's the friendliness or straight-laced approach to it. But it's a vibe and the people around you that create and that recognise culture. Now, we all have our vision, mission statements and value statements that we have within our organisations, I'm sure. But how often do businesses define and write down what culture they want to create? It can sit in some of the value statements and mission and vision statements, but often it's not very well described in terms of how you want people to behave as part of that. It's not something that can be emailed out from internal comms or even from the CEO saying, create me a great culture. It is created by people regardless of what you do. So culture is created by the people, not by an organisation. And I think that's very interesting to differentiate, because it's the sort of thing that goes upwards, sideways, downwards, inwards and outwards of an organization. But it's absolutely critical that if you want to be successful, is you get culture right, and therefore people do it because they want to do it, rather than because actually they have to. And now a brand synonymous with fantastic culture is Virgin Media, and in particular Virgin Media Business. And I'm pleased to say we have with Karen Weaver here today. So Karen, what is the culture like at Virgin Media Business?
Right, well, I think you used the word naff, didn't you? But I'm going to use the word cheesy. So it sounds really cheesy, but at Virgin Media Business, there's a real sense of a family feel. So although we've got over 3,000 employees in Virgin Media Business across quite a nationally dispersed locations, and we're part of a Virgin Media, which is obviously about 15,000 people, and then Liberty Global is our parent company with 30,000 people, that could feel like quite a corporate environment, but actually we have a true Virgin spirit and a real family feel.
Perfect. So it sounds like a great place to work, and indeed it is, having known and worked with you for many years. But why are we now taking it so seriously? I think one of the interesting challenges that we're facing at the moment, with employment rates at the lowest and staff retention declining, people are choosing the people they want to work with much more effectively, and culture plays a huge part of it. I think what's interesting is millennials have played a major driver in this transition in the workplace culture, because they're demanding more from employers to define and create a great culture. But interestingly, culture is, you can't control it. And I think there's much more visibility now online and in social around people. If they have a bad experience with an organization, they can absolutely post it and social it. So all of a sudden, if a new employee in Best Talent is looking at your organization, actually you need to take account of what's going on in the social world as well. So you can start to see how your brand and your culture is being portrayed, because you don't have any control over that. There are lots of things going on at the moment with, and have been for years, to be honest, in terms of the best places to work types of surveys. And there's a reason for that, because people want to be seen as a great place to work. So they attract the best talent, and they're able to recruit the best people. But there are much more benefits to having a great culture. People tend to be happier at work, and so therefore they have better satisfaction. And it can also lead to reduced stress levels within an organisation as well. It also has better loyalty to a company, so people don't leave as much and stuff. And also, I think, interestingly, when we have a great culture, it can actually lead to increased revenues for a business. So it's not all about cost. Employees do want to engage more, and they want to feel part of something. And when you create culture, and particularly engagement, which is, I suppose, the role IC play as part of that, is the results are outstanding. You know, companies with engaged employees are 233% greater customer loyalty and see a 26% greater annual increase in revenue, which is brilliant. Organisations with high employee engagement outperform those with low engagement by 202%. And this is the most interesting one for me, was when people believe in a senior leadership team, that's the strongest engagement driver for an organisation. But interestingly, the second is the individual growth and development of that individual. So, Karen, would you agree with some of those, and what are you doing linked to this?
Yeah, so at Virgin Media Business, employee engagement is really important to us, so creating that culture, so much so that it's actually one of our strategic pillars, and actually our senior leadership team have employee engagement as one of their targets. So across Virgin Media as a whole, we actually have an always listening approach. So although we do employee surveys, they tend to be pulse surveys, so shorter surveys and more frequently, and there's lots of other employee touch points where people can give us feedback that I think we're going to go into a bit later on. To touch on what you said as well, you know, we know that happy employees make happy customers. Happy customers generate more revenue, so it's very important to us. And fundamentally, we believe that people really need to know the what and the how of the business. So why should someone at Virgin Media Business get up in the morning and come to work? You know, what's it all about?
Perfect. Thanks. So the single common denominator in every business is people. I think everybody knows that. And everybody is an individual, and individuals have certain needs. No matter how big or small your organization, it's the people that make things happen. It's the people who deliver the strategy and deliver the plan. And it comes down to the basic instincts of what people need. They want to believe in something. They want to trust in their leaders, their managers, their colleagues, and their customers. They want to connect emotionally with the business. They don't just want to turn up to work and do a job. And generally, people want to do the right thing. You never turn up to work and say, I want to do the wrong thing today. And they want to feel part of something and making a real difference in that. So how can we influence that? Well, I'm not a neuroscientist, but what's interesting for us when we're creating some of our creativity or our engagement and tactics and deliverables is understanding how the human brain works. And this is it's not so much about culture, but it's very much about human behavior, which drives actually culture. When we're communicating, how often do we have in our minds how people want to be communicated to? I've observed lots of left brain communication over my 20 or so years in the industry, which is very left brain, very factual, very process, and very logical. But it's interesting when you start to understand how people retain information, the memories, the feelings, the emotion, that all comes from the right side of the brain. And how often are we asking people to think differently or deal with change? Well, actually creativity and imagination also come from the right side of the brain. So it's important that we do have a balance of both sides when we're trying to communicate and we're trying to connect with that. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that when we communicate, whether it's a face-to-face, whether it's in some form of communication interaction, that we actually bear in mind that we need to connect with both sides of the brain as part of it. Now, obviously, we've been working with Virgin Media Business for about 3 years now, 3 or 4 years, which has been fantastic. And what I think we've helped them do is to try and think differently about how we communicate. And I'd just like to ask Karen to share some of those great stories around what we do.
So, I think what Top Banana have really helped us do, to your point, is in some of our events. So we do lots of, as we would call them, leadership events. So at the beginning of the year, we like to set out what their vision is for the year, the operating plan and the strategy. And actually, by really looking at what the audience wants, what we want them to think, feel or do, we now do these events in a completely different way. But we've also introduced senior leadership visibility. So that's a real engagement driver for us in B&B. No surprise, I think it's an engagement driver in lots of different companies. But this year we've also launched something called site mapping. So because we've got quite a few different locations, we've actually mapped our senior leadership team to each of those locations. So basically they're responsible for knowing that location inside and out, really getting under the skin of what the highlights are and also any gripes, because we tend to find that they're very location based. And actually they do town halls here, they cascade our operating plan, but also we just encourage them to actually put my teeth in, work out of those locations and just chat to people, have general drop-in surgeries and things like that. The other thing we've done around senior leadership, very basic, but back to the floors. It was always a perception thing really, but historically when we've done back to the floors, the sites would get very excited that the MD was coming and literally roll out the red carpet, and there'd be memos going out for people to make sure desks were clean, etc. Definitely don't do that anymore. And actually when the senior leadership team are going back to the floor, we actually get them to do stuff. So when they go and sit down with revenue and assurance, we actually have our MD calling people, asking them for money, and we create it fun by basically competitions of who gets the most money, but similarly with sales. So at one point we had our MD who has a very strong sales background, making sales calls, and was actually asked by one of our customers if he was an apprentice. So that was good fun, and we actually recorded that call and sent it out to our people with his permission. So lots of ways to try and make our senior leadership team much more visible and approachable.
One of the interesting things, Karen, on the face-to-face side of things, how important is it to have that sort of, and we often talk about the open door policy, which is easily set. What are the leadership team doing within your organisation to be more visible?
So as I said, the site mapping, but again, really basic things. So when I first started in this role about 3.5 years ago now, the senior leadership team basically had their desks all together and big filing cabinets around them. So they'd literally built a wall around them, not intentionally at all. Whereas now they have hot desks and people can actually go and see them. But they also lead from the front. So we have things like volunteering days and charity challenges. So we've set a charity challenge this year that people can really get behind. So our charity partner is Scope. And we're on a mission to help 1 million disabled people into the workplace by 2020. And actually, our managing director and his senior leadership team recently did the 3 Peaks Challenge. So that's not an easy challenge to do. And actually, they raised over £3,000 towards that. And it's really encouraged our people to think about ways that they could then raise money. So they really do lead from the front.
And what sort of things, and we talked, some of the work that we do is around having fun when we're trying to land messages. Have you got any examples of some of that sort of stuff that we do?
Yeah, so well, for example, today we're in our Hemel Hempstead office. The senior leadership team have been here for 2 days, and yesterday we actually set them a challenge against the floor, if that's the right word to use, and it was pumpkin carving. So the SLT were all blindfolded and had to do create some interesting looking pumpkins, but also in some of our events that we've worked on with you guys, it's just basically creating experiences that people won't expect. So on day 2 of our sales kickoff, for example, when people perhaps come in a bit weary, actually they walk into a room and there's running machines, pogo sticks, bean bags, all the rest of it. And actually the message we were trying to get across, which was a big reveal with our Scope challenge and with our incentive program, the message totally landed and they had a lot of fun at the same time.
Perfect. It's interesting actually, because I think a lot of organisations and people retain things more when they're smiling. So if you can try and make people smile as part of a message giver, actually they do retain much more information. Two-way dialogue, how important is that in terms of what sort of things are you doing from making sure you get the voices of the people?
Yeah, so again, when I started in this role, one of the first things I noticed was we were actually very good at broadcasting. So we're extremely good at broadcasting messages out to lots of people. But one of the things that was lacking was that two-way feedback loop. Over the last few years, that's really improved, and actually it was just a question of dialing up mechanics that already existed. So we have a fantastic group called the National Voice Forum, which is an employee consultative committee, and actually we then have national committees and national, divisional and local committees. That's a fantastic, now this is going to sound like the wrong word, but a fantastic tool for internal comms practitioners, because actually any campaign that we're launching, we will road test it with that group first, because they'll give us really very brutally honest feedback and help us launch certain projects. And we also, as I said, when we're doing town halls or back to the floors, they're not formal, so people can ask questions at any point, and there's always Q&A in everything that we do. There's lots of touch points outside the normal surveys that people do where people can ask questions.
And how do you obviously you communicate in lots of different channels, whether that be webinars such as this, calls, emails, events, etc. How do you ensure that you keep all of those things going and make them relevant for the various people?
Yeah, so I think I sort of touched on the numbers earlier. So Virgin Media Business is about 3,000 people, including offshore, that can go anything up to about 4,000. So although we do lots of all Virgin Media Business messages, we've also done audience segmentation, so audience personas works. So we know by function how people like to receive information, what things really matter to them, and actually it's a real mix, because we've got a subsection of mainly a sales force. So quite honestly, they don't really want to hear from us unless it's how they're going to hit their numbers or exceed their numbers. So we have to link everything into that. Then we also have a large population actually out on the road, digging up streets, fixing services, who don't even have access to emails, for example. So we have to, so we agree the messaging framework with our senior leadership team, but we have to be very creative in how we get that message out to the different groups.
Perfect.
And then, of course, across to Virgin Media and any messages that we want to go up to Liberty Global and back down.
One of the challenges that we faced recently, Karen, was engaging your level D community, which is, I think,
nearly 600.
600 people.
Yeah.
Whereas we're actually very good at doing the face-to-face communication with what we class as A to C, which is your senior leadership team. One of the, I think, the results came back from the engagement survey, I think, was to saying that actually level Ds don't feel as engaged. Just talk us through what you did, because it was more about we came up with the ideas, but you actually ended up implementing it.
Yeah, so I'm sure as lots of people on this call experience, when you get your focus group or employee survey results back, it's always really fun to go through those and try and pull out any key themes. And what we were noticing is almost a bit of a concrete level, if you like. So our leadership team, which we would call sort of exec directors and heads of department, felt very well informed, but actually what they weren't doing was cascading the key messages down to almost the middle management layer. So level Ds would be our management population, basically. We went even further than that and split that population into two. So we've got our middle managers who manage people, and then our middle managers who are experts, if you like. So SMEs in a certain role that they do. So what we've done is conducted focus groups within those, and also the site mapping that we did with the help with you guys was specifically aimed at making sure our senior leadership team were tying in with that management community, going out to the key sites where they were based and cascading those messages. But it's a real focus area for us. And actually, when we look at events moving forward, we're even looking at, right, should our events be for our leadership community, or should it actually be for this level 5 population? Because they're the ones that people have daily interactions with.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about the middle managers, if you like, are that they want to be engaged, they want to be communicated to. And I think one of the interesting things is we didn't necessarily come up with just turn up at an office and do a town hall. It was very interactive. They had games they had to play to understand the messages, and they were able to. And interestingly, when I arrived today, I was seeing the board that they guys created relating to that communication, which is constantly updated as part of it. There's lots more props and rubber rings and all sorts of random
They really made
stuff.
It their own.
They've made it very Virgin, which is fantastic. Perfect. Thanks, Karen. I sound like a real interviewer. So one of the, in terms of how can internal comms help this whole process of building culture, I think the key thing, I suppose, at the start of the process is help define the culture you want. Now, I'm conscious that we're talking with Virgin Media Business today around, and they're a very fun organisation. Virgin as a brand is very open, but there may be more what I class as shirt and tie type of organisations, I'm sure, on the line in terms of how do they build their culture that they want. But I think it's doing the same stuff. It's just about doing it in the way you want it done, and defining the culture that you want as an organisation. But if you want it to happen and you want it to deliver well, you've got to ensure the leadership team are living and breathing it, and they've got to be visible. They've got to be accessible. And I think most importantly, and whenever we do surveys around trust or what do people want to believe in, it's about honesty and authenticity. And that is absolutely fundamental to any organisation. And I think there's a very fine line now between internal communication and external communications. Whatever you say internally is in the outside world before you can say anything really. I think you've got to create a belief in the values. So values and the vision strategy shouldn't be a poster on the wall. It should be very live and breathe within it. And I think to Karen's point, it's about consistent, regular communications that's relevant to your different audiences, making sure that they get to know what they want to know, how they want to know it, in the variety of different media and tactics that you're able to communicate in. I think you need to be encourage your leadership to be more honest and personal. I think everybody loves to tell a story, but maybe connect it to their personal wants and needs of the business, and make employees feel that they're listened to, and create that two-way dialogue. Often when we deal with middle managers or we talk to middle managers, sometimes because they don't have the honesty and openness within an organisation, it tends to either I call it the apple crumble. So the fruit below is the sort of employees delivering the day-to-day, and it actually stops at the crust of the apple crumble, because it doesn't break through, because middle managers are afraid or not able to speak openly. But it's about how can you break through that crust, and how can you get make employees feel that they're listened to, regardless of what role they play within an organisation. Trust is a big part of everything, and trustworthy behaviours from everybody, whatever role you play, I think is absolutely, and accountability and responsibility is a key part of that. And understanding as an employee what your role is in delivering that strategy. It's all very well just saying a strategy, this is our plan, this is what we do, but unless you know your role in it, and often you find that organisations are spending time doing stuff that's not even linked to the strategy, so why are they even bothering? And make them feel part of something, because everybody wants to feel involved, part of something, and also make a difference. And I think that, Karen talked about a huge organisation here with Liberty Global, Virgin Media, and Virgin Media Business, and absolutely keep that alive in terms of what we do. So just to wrap up, and happy to take questions in a moment. Culture is good for business, for people, but it's also profitable. Organisations with great culture make more money. So there's no denying it. IC play a huge part in creating that fantastic culture. We see it in lots of organisations. It's not just about communicating, it's about doing things within an organisation to create that fantastic culture. It's led from the front. You can't try and create a culture if the senior leadership team are not delivering the same values, behaviours, actions, and same cultural things. That people tend to mirror behaviour, so therefore they need to embrace it too. And then think about creating what actions and behaviours you want to see when you're defining your culture, because it will pay off in the end. And I always say it's like create a movement, create a culture as part of it. Happy to take any questions that anybody has. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Richard and Karen. So I've been monitoring the feed, and there's a couple of questions coming through. So I will go with the first one, which was how do you feed info and insight back into the global business that is Virgin?
Yeah, good question. So I guess I'm quite fortunate in this one, because actually Virgin Media Business is a big revenue driver for Liberty Global. So we deal with the SOHO customers, which is basically small office, home office. And actually that's the biggest growth driver in Liberty Global at the moment. So they're really interested in what we're doing. So it's an open door, which is great. But in terms of channels and mechanics, we actually have something called Ask the EC. So that's where we will interview our executive committee. So that would be the managing director for Virgin Media Business, and then his counterparts across Virgin Media and Liberty Global. And people can ask questions anonymously or put their names forward. And basically that could be questions about any part of the company or any part of Liberty Global. And also just then in terms of how internal comms is set up, I work in a central function. So although I support one division of Virgin Media, I work very closely with my colleagues who support Liberty Global and then the other functions. So we will always share stories two ways and use our channels and platforms to share those stories. It's definitely not nailed, we could get better at it, but we do share those stories.
Thank you. So I'll move on to the next question. So you talked a lot about events today as well. Someone's asking, do you use social channels as part of your work?
Yes. So, well, if I'm interpreting social as correct, so one of our biggest channels is actually WebEx Social. So it's a Cisco platform, and basically we've created a digital space called More Best Days. I mean, the irony, it's not very good use of the English language, but More Best Days. So that's basically, it's almost a bit of a copy of Facebook for Business, I guess is the best way to describe it. And that's where our people will upload posts to demonstrating where they've had a best day. So that tends to be if they've done a volunteering day, if they've gone the extra mile for a customer or a person, one of their colleagues. Today, most of the pictures are actually of the pumpkin carving challenge from yesterday. And actually, how we've sort of driven traffic to that site is basically we've incorporated it into our recognition scheme as well. So we use gamification as part of the social collaboration tool. And basically, the more comments or likes on people's best days, the more chances they get recognised in our Sparkle event. So that's the platform we use internally for social.
And we're also, when we're doing events, we also do a lot of digital applications in terms of what and how we create the community that we do. So we actually have obviously apps and things in terms of some of what we do, but which is fantastic.
That's brilliant. I'm loving Pumpkin Carving Day. I think that sounds fantastic. You've actually inspired me to go home and even buy a pumpkin now. So I'm just going to move on now. There's quite a few questions coming through. So someone is now asking, there's lots of obviously support as well, by the way, on the feed in terms of what you're doing in the culture. So that's fantastic. But somebody's also asking, how did you choose which senior leader team member to map to each site?
Locked away in a very dark room.
Yeah.
No, so I guess I should define what we mean by senior leaders. So that's a population of about 120 people in Virgin Media Business, and that's our directors, exec directors and heads of department. So part of it was geographic, part of it was what function they work in, and also based on the feedback that we've had from each site, we've tried to map personalities. So if we know a certain site is crying out for something in particular, based on our relationships that we have with that team, we've mapped them to those sites. So I wouldn't like to say it's a particular science. We've been doing it, I think we officially launched it in May, didn't we? Yeah. So we've had a couple of teething problems, but generally the feedback has been fantastic. And then as we have new leaders joining the business, we continue mapping them to those sites.
And one of the things that was really interesting about the whole process was when we had the leadership meeting in the first instance, we actually gave some training around, so we ensured we got consistency in terms of what do we mean by owning a site and how do we communicate within a site, because sometimes senior leaders are great at their job, but maybe not so good at communicating at times. So how can we make sure we get more of a consistency? So they had an element of a toolbox or a toolkit that they went out with to help them deliver a consistent communication across the whole business, really. So some sites didn't suffer just because they got not a great communicator.
Yeah, I like the idea as well about personality mapping. I think that's really that's a good thing. That's a good consideration as well. Anyway, on to the next question. Someone says, everyone says culture is important, but how do you think you can truly get buy-in so that things like IC are truly invested in?
That's a great question. I think.
Well, I don't know if I understand that question.
Is the question relate to how do you get buy-in from a senior leadership around culture?
Yeah, I think what really we're saying is, we know that culture is becoming really important. We're talking about it as a community, but how do we, for those perhaps where it's not high on the agenda, how do we get them to buy into the importance of culture, and then also how they invest their energies in things like internal comms, which can really activate that. So really, how do we make a business case, I guess, for culture?
Yeah, I mean, case studies.
It's the proof in the pudding, really. I think it's important to understand what your business is trying to achieve from a culture, because I think that's important, depending on what your personality or your DNA of your organisation is. But I think it goes to show that if you've got happy people, then happy people work harder, and therefore, you have the way they communicate to their customers is better. So therefore, it's sort of a no-brainer, and there are plenty of case studies online around great culture results, as it were.
And I think that it is a tricky one, and I think it also relies a bit on stakeholder management skills. So we've all come up against managers, senior leaders who, as the question asked, just don't buy into it at all. So it's actually a case of, do they even need to know that we're talking about internal comms or culture? It's what's keeping you awake at night? How can I help you with your problems? And actually, quite often the answer is communicating to your people, getting everyone brought into the same message. So it's just being a bit clever about how you deal with some of those trickier stakeholders, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of a lot of things, but you know, if you can find any evidence, as you say, or case study to substantiate your argument, that's really, really helpful. So again, following a similar theme, someone is asking, how do you engage senior leadership in getting involved in these cultural programs and sales? Because often some people say the answer they get is we don't have time. So how do we make them put it on as a priority, I guess?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say is, I'd ask the question to the senior leaders is, are you happy with the culture you have? And is there anything you want to change around the way people turn up to work? And if you depend on what the answer to that question is, because some people might want a very, as somebody put, and I mentioned earlier, shirt and tie, quite straight-laced, can't have, you know, fun in the workplace is perceived to be not the done thing. But so I think you ask the question first off, are you happy with where we're at? And is there anything you want to do differently? Because unless you get buy-in, you're not going to change the culture. And unless the senior leader is behaving in that way, then you're just flogging a dead horse in one sense.
And really simply, although I know this can sometimes be like Marmite, some people agree with it, some people don't. In VMB, it's part of the strategy, it's part of the pillar. So actually our senior leadership team are measured on the engagement within their teams and the feedback, and it's taken very seriously. And also our managing director will do something called skip level sessions. So actually where he'll go around to the different sites and speak to people while the management team aren't in the room, so that people feel empowered to actually say how they're really feeling. So I think there's lots of ways you can tackle it.
Fantastic, thank you. So the next question is, someone says, we've talked a lot about defining a culture, but someone's asking, what do we do with that? Is it written anywhere, or do we explicitly talk to people about it? I had a question jotted down as well from myself, which I think kind of links to it, because today is World Values Day. So, you know, is it something around actually, if we write those values, is that actually what it is in the written word? And how do we get values beyond the paper, I guess, which is a lot more.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because one of the things that I do within my business is actually share some pictures of what I believe the culture is. You know, do you want to work with a company that looks like this, looks like this, looks like this? Because sometimes pictures can paint 1,000 words, and you don't have to say what it is. But it's then, okay, so if that's what we want, then what do we need to do to start to create some of those things? Whether that's CSR activity, you know, and Virgin Media do some fantastic stuff with Scope to help that. And I do think that helps build the culture, because the senior, you know, we did some stuff with the yacht race. What was that? Recently with Scope, incentive around. You're doing it. There's a guy who's gone to set sail.
Sorry. Yeah, Ian Hoddle did a round the UK boat race. Yes, where we used his boat as sponsorship for Scope and for VMB. But you know, he did an incredible feat. And people really got behind him, and they were tracking all the miles he'd done and everything. And he raised a lot of money as well.
And it's doing initiatives like that people go, oh wow, that's fantastic that an organisation is doing stuff. So when you define the culture, I think it is some of it's around what behaviours do you want to see. Maybe it's some images that you want to create. Maybe it's a statement or a phrase, or it is difficult, because it is the mystifying stuff that you never see, but it's there and you feel it.
It's kind of, I always say it's like this intangibility in the air. You kind of want to grab it, but you can't quite. So it's a funny thing, isn't it, in that way? So I'll move swiftly on to the next question. Someone asked, how have Virgin Media measured success? Have you any ideas that you've had to be abandoned or amended?
Gosh, okay. What, an internal comms perspective? So I think
internal comms culture.
Sorry.
In culture, things you've done.
So really demystifying this whole senior leadership visibility thing, I think, would be the biggest thing. So quite often it's all about perception, but as we all know, vision becomes reality. So we'd get comments around, oh well, so and so didn't open the door for me as they went through, but actually when you look at it, it's because they were on a phone call and they were trying to get into a room. So it's, they're just human beings at the end of the day. So we do a lot of myth busting, I think. So when we get feedback from our people, either from the surveys or through focus groups or just general feedback, we like to do a lot of myth busting around, these are just human beings who really want to hear from you and really speak to you. So that's, we probably haven't changed a lot of stuff because of that, but we've been really honest around, well, this is what that meant, rather than actually, they didn't want to speak to you. So that's probably the biggest thing we've looked at. In terms of things that we've stopped, as I mentioned earlier, we were very good at broadcasting, whereas now it tends to be more two-way and a lot of social collaboration. So we actively, as part of our audience persona research, find out what people want to hear about, and then obviously link that back to our strategy. I hope that answers the question.
And particularly some of these stuff that we do around we do a lot of surveys or to work out how engaged the community following this, and are they going to deliver the plan for the next 12 months. And I think I have to say, last year I think we got a 97% engagement level within the 450 people, which we never thought we'd beat. And this year we got 98% engagement levels in terms of knowing what they've got to do to deliver, which I think is absolutely great. Okay. Any more questions?
Sorry.
Do you have people specifically focused on culture?
Yes, I can see a question on here. So do you have people in your organisation who are specifically focused on culture, or is it just the work of the whole IC team? Yeah, it's a bit of a mix, actually. So we have a department in the people team called Employee Experience, and they look across the whole of Virgin Media. So it's like a centre of excellence, if you like, who then work with the HR business partners. So they're the ones that actually operate the surveys. And analyse the results, but also look at things like induction, how people feel when they come for an interview, how people come if they get a job versus if they're rejected, all of that type of stuff. So there's lots of good work that happens in the experience team, and we work very closely with them.
And I think on that point, I think it's everybody's responsibility to deliver the culture, and I think it's about how you the people that will go in terms of what they're going to do to help build the culture and create the culture that you want, and how do you share the ambitions and the ambitions of the business. I know certainly within Banana we have a culture club, which is made up of a cross section of people within our organisation, and it's their job to ensure we're delivering on the promises of our culture every single day, and we do lots of stuff relating to bringing it to life.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Ah, brilliant. Sorry, my microphone went blank there, so that's why I was suddenly a silence, but I'm back on now. Picking up, great. Thank you for picking up the thread on the questions. There's lots of things in here around, I think you've used things like NPS and ENPS scores. Yes.
Yeah, so NPS is Net Promoter Score. So that's basically our survey where we work out what our customers think of us. So it basically comes out with a score. So it's all around perception. So how was their experience with us? what would they tell their friends, colleagues, or family about us, and would they use us again? And actually, eNPS is when you then link that to employee experience. So yes, we do use that in our survey, and through the demographics that we use in the survey, there's a clear link that our frontline staff who have interactions with customers and have high NPS scores also have high engagement scores. It's definitely a clear link.
That's great. Thank you. There seems to be quite a thread in here where people are listening in and obviously getting some great inspiration, but I think they've got some blocks in their organisations. But some people are asking as well, how do you begin the conversation involving the leadership team, on colleagues, on defining the culture we want, going from the mission and the value statements to a shared understanding of internal culture?
So I think it's around, didn't we talk at the beginning about the what, why, and the how? So I think a lot of companies focus on what, so what is it we're going to do? But actually, how are we going to do it, and why are we going to do it? So those are the pertinent questions to ask, and that brings out the behaviours that we need to see to be able to deliver these results and the bottom line. But also, as we were talking about earlier, in terms of case studies, and there is, Richard's included some stats in his presentation. There is so many stats out there about how, a healthy culture and a good employee engagement score equates to happy employees, happy customers, and greater revenue.
One of the things that we do often with clients, particularly linked to culture, is something called a discovery workshop, where we ask lots of questions around culture, and lots of words and phrases come out. And it could be everything from the environment to the behaviours, the actions, and it's just getting people in a room and say, when you come to work, what would you want to see? What do you want to get people to do, and how would they be behaving? What would they be delivering? How would they be connecting with each other? And if you start to get all of that into a map, if you like, around, I'm using my hands here, which doesn't help. We plot it all over the walls, and then you start to get an understanding. Okay, I can start to see that. And then how do you get that across to the organisation? And again, this is something that's not delivered overnight. It's something that does take time to implement, and it does take you guys having a conversation with the leadership team saying, I think we can improve our culture. I think we can get better results as part of that. Can we have a conversation around culture and how we bring that to life within our organisation? How do we start shifting the needle for having a great culture? And that's part of it. It's just having a conversation.
That's great, thank you. I think, and there's something, so you talked about so much amazing work that you guys have been doing, but I think somebody's asked, well, you've got lots of stuff that's happening, but how do you keep that momentum? How do you keep going with that buy-in from colleagues across all areas of the business?
It's hard. Yeah, but it is. I mean, the thing about Virgin Media and this Virgin Media business is a constantly challenging organisation, and we have to work with Karen's team constantly in terms of trying to make sure that we deliver stuff. And don't get me wrong, a lot of our role is more advisory at times, not necessarily implementing, because Virgin Media have an events team as well as a communications team. But it's very much we understand the DNA, we understand what we're trying to do. So sometimes it's about us coming up with ideas around what the problems are. It's about, and tell me if I'm wrong here, Karen, it's about making sure the team are regularly and consistently delivering communications. But then asking the questions, what are the blockers for the future, and then you start to then solve some of them as you go through the process.
Yeah, I think it's about constantly evaluating what you're doing as well. So we don't perhaps have as modern channels as we would like for a technology company, but for those channels that do allow us to see how many people are actually reading what we're sending or commenting on there, we will on a monthly basis look at hits on our campaign digitally and emails and things like that, and we can see where things aren't hitting the mark or where things really are. So we will dial up things that are and perhaps look at different ways of delivering certain messages where they're not. And I talked about stakeholder management before. I think it's so key for internal comms to build really strong relationships with the senior leadership team. So our senior leadership team have a monthly business review where they go off site for 2 days a month. I will always be at those meetings, not necessarily for the whole 2 days, but we will always have a slot where we talk about what's coming up, what we need to be working on, talking about engagement, etc. So it's about keeping that really close relationship. I wouldn't be able to do my job without that relationship.
And some of your team are mapped to certain leaders, aren't they?
Yeah.
So they only have the different departments.
We're set up a bit like an HR function, so the IoIC model. So yeah, we're very much believe in business partnering. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So someone's asked a good question. Is it so you've mentioned shirt and tie organisations. We're one of them. Public sector, highly scrutinised during political football in the press. So as a result, we have to be very careful about promoting culture internally in case it is picked up externally, and that doesn't look like we're on a jolly. What steps would you recommend to promote a culture but ensure it links to corporate goals, particularly if the organisation is technically funded by the public purse?
I think regardless of whether it's government organisation or not, I think culture doesn't have to cost money. It's about people coming to work and doing and making a difference. So what I challenge, you can still define what culture you want to create, whether you wear shirt and ties or trainers. It doesn't really make a difference. You define the culture in terms of what you do, and then it's about making sure people understand the reasons why they come to work. And therefore having making a difference. But I get that sometimes there's an element of being shackled, if you like, by the past and how things have been done before. It takes a brave leader to maybe just break down some of that and do things differently. But as this world is evolving, and it will never be as slow again in terms of the change within business and the world. I think businesses need to adapt, or they just won't necessarily recruit the best.
And interestingly, with BNP, so it's a B2B side of Virgin Media, we have lots of public sector customers, and actually that's where we tend to get a lot of our good news stories from. So when it's hard to explain what Virgin business actually does, so we say we want to be the most recommended B2B telecom provider. Actually, the real stories that get under people's skin are where we help ambulance services or councils or schools or small businesses. So actually I would think about telling some of those external success stories internally, so people really understand what it is that sector is doing, and actually what the general public would do if that didn't exist, because they'd be stuffed.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. So someone else is asking, how do you encourage diversity and inclusion within your culture? What if someone's style doesn't fit with your culture?
That's a really good one, and it's something I'm really passionate about, actually. So I think I said at the beginning, when you ask people what's great about working at Virgin Media, and indeed Virgin Media Business, they say the people. And actually, to expand on that, what they also say is I can bring myself to work. So that's something that we really encourage, and that really helps with diversity and inclusion, because we don't ask people to change their personalities, their demeanours when they come and work here, and actually they can really bring their personality and their true self to work. And that is the reason why I'm still here after 6 years. So I've only been in this role for 3 years. I've been in Virgin Media for 6, and it's the only true company I've worked for where I can really be myself.
And I think that's really important. Actually, one of the things I always talk about is around when people have a job title, they often try and behave what the job title demands of them. But it's so much harder than just being research. So actually, you've been recruited for a reason. So be yourself rather than trying to be somebody that you're expected to be.
And the biggest tip I would ever give, and which for now, it's just really stuck with me, is when you're recruiting and looking at talent, don't recruit the right person for the job. Now, it sounds absolutely ludicrous, but it's actually recruit the right person for the team and for the company. So we're obsessed with recruiting people with the best qualifications and being the best in their field. But actually, when you look at your team dynamics and the company dynamics, you need to think about that as well, and that really helps promote a diverse workforce.
Yeah, and one of the things we do at Top Banana is very much focused on recruiting based on the value. So we call ourselves bananas, and we say, okay, is this person first time they come into a meeting room for an interview? Are they a banana first question? And then you tend to know that whether they are or not.
I like that phrase. That works for me. I'm going to ask myself, I'm banana. So someone, probably a lot of people say yes. So someone else has now asked as well. 2/3 of your colleagues are home-based. Any top tips on how we can best engage with them and help them feel an integral part of our culture?
Gosh, yes, that's a tough one. We do actually have quite a lot of home workers, especially in some of our more, as we call it, professional areas. I think that's really then down to the tools that you use. So actually, the social collaboration tools, WebExes, you can have team huddles virtually. You really have to then pull in on your digital and virtual channels that you have. But also, if budgets allow face-to-face meetups, even if they're once a year or twice a year, I think it's good to have that face-to-face if budgets allow it.
And it's a two-way thing, I think, for mobile workers, because they have to engage with the business and not just sit in their remote world. I always get a little frustrated when the remote workers often say, oh, well, business doesn't necessarily communicate to me that often, or a business, I'm very detached from the organisation. But I always say, well, what are you doing to connect with the business? Because there are plenty of things out there. We had a all hands call this morning for Virgin Media, which is basically everybody can dial in, and we've had record attendance. But that's about people wanting to dial into that. And again, that's a cultural thing. People engaging because they want to, not because they have to. And I think that's really important. It's not just transmit, it's about people engaging with that as well.
Oh, fantastic, thank you. Someone has asked now as well, do you have people in your organisation specifically focused on culture, or is it work of the whole IC team?
So I think that's one that I answered when your microphone stopped working.
My apologies, I was so busy clicking for the microphone, I didn't hear that you'd answer that. So, right, I'll move on to the next one. What methods do you employ to ensure that employees working remotely are kept informed? Well, mind you, you've just talked about that one. And someone's talked about, how do you manage the crossover in accountability when senior leaders own a site but are not necessarily in the line management of those based there?
Yeah, that's a good one actually, because when we rolled out our sort of site mapping program, we used our divisional voice forum when we first rolled it out, and then actually went back to them and went, right, tell us how it's really going, how are these town halls and general chats going, and some of the feedback we had was, generally very, very positive. But actually, are the people at those sites just talking about their department, or are they talking about all the topics that are relevant for that location? And that's been a bit hit and miss, so that's something we've actually worked on. So we expected that our senior leaders would be able to talk about pan Virgin Media business rather than just their function, for example, sales or in-life or delivery. And in some small pockets, they were just talking about their function. So the way we've got around that is basically by encouraging them to actually spend more physical time at that location, and literally just working from that location, speaking to the people, holding informal drop-ins so they can really get under the skin and know what are the hot topics for that, but also linking in with the line management community there, and also the DVF reps.
That's fantastic. And that was our last question, and it's exactly 3 p.m. So I think that we've run that through perfectly. And that was great to have so many questions from everybody. Thank you so much, Richard and Karen. That was brilliant. There was lots of insightful information, lots of top tips, lots of takeaways. And obviously looking at the number of questions, obviously we've really sparked a great debate here. And so thank you so much to both of you for your time today. It's been really fantastic.
Thanks, and thanks everybody for listening.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Yeah, there was 93.
It was about 170, I think, and then it dropped to 100.
Hi, Richard. Karen, you still there?